A sudden, sharp sound cut through the courtroom's tension, the unexpected, disrespectful laughter of a court clerk aimed directly at the poised figure standing before the bench. The air froze, thick with silent challenge, as the woman met the clerk's gaze, a stillness gathering within her, knowing the moment demanded far more than just enduring the insult. The heavy oak door swung shut behind her, sealing her inside the hushed, high-ceilinged space. Judge Reed's courtroom always felt like a cage, gilded but still a cage. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting from the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood, the stern portraits on the walls, the impassive faces of the bailiffs. Delilah Brooks walked towards the plaintiff's table, her brief resting lightly in her hand. Her footsteps echoed softly. She felt the weight of the room pressing in, the silent judgment that seemed baked into the very air. This wasn't just another hearing, it felt different. Judge Reed sat elevated, a figure of stone behind his massive bench. Beside him, slightly lower, sat the court clerk, Martha. Martha's expression was usually neutral, almost bored. Today, something else flickered behind her eyes as Delilah approached. A small, almost imperceptible smirk played on her lips. Delilah didn't acknowledge it, focusing instead on the task ahead, on the argument she was about to make. She placed her brief on the table, the sound muffled by the felt surface. The opposing counsel, Mr. Henderson, a man whose arrogance preceded him, watched her from his table, a condescending tilt to his head. The gallery was sparse today, a few reporters, a couple of observers. They were silent, waiting. The air conditioning hummed faintly, a counterpoint to the tension building in the room. Delilah smoothed the non-existent wrinkle on her suit jacket, her fingers steady. She felt her pulse beating evenly in her wrists. Judge Reed cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "We are here this morning concerning case number 23 CV 419, Brooks vs. Sterling Corporation. Ms. Brooks, you are representing the plaintiff?" His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Delilah inclined her head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. Delilah Brooks, on behalf of Mr. Thomas Sterling." She spoke clearly, her voice calm and measured. As she spoke, she saw Martha the clerk shift in her seat. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of annoyance, a slight roll of the eyes. It was quick, almost missed, but Delilah caught it. It was a dismissal, a silent scoff. It felt personal. Delilah kept her gaze on the judge, refusing to give Martha the satisfaction of a reaction. She outlined the basis of their motion, her points crisp and logical. She felt the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, preparing his counter. The judge listened, his face unreadable. Delilah knew this judge had a reputation. Fair, some said, but cold. Others whispered he had his favorites, and they weren't always on the side of people like Thomas Sterling. She finished her opening statement, pausing for a beat before she sat. She felt the silence hang heavy. Then, the small sound came again. A quiet, controlled chuckle from Martha. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was jarring, disrespectful. It was directed at Delilah. Delilah felt the blood prickle just beneath her skin, a flash of heat that she immediately suppressed. She didn't look at Martha. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, maintaining her composure. The judge didn't react. He seemed not to have heard, or perhaps, chose not to acknowledge it. Mr. Henderson, however, caught it. A slight smile touched his lips, a shared amusement with the clerk. It was a small alliance formed in disrespect. Delilah took a slow, silent breath. She needed to stay focused, to not let this derail her. This case was too important. Thomas Sterling, an older man, had lost his life savings to a predatory scheme, and Sterling Corporation was trying to bury him in paperwork and legal jargon. Delilah was his last hope. She gripped the edge of the table lightly under the wood, her knuckles white. She could feel the eyes on her, waiting for a sign of weakness, for her calm to crack. She would not give them that. She shifted her weight, settling deeper into her chair. She observed Martha from her periphery. The clerk was now busying herself with papers, her face carefully blank. But the energy around her felt different, charged with a quiet antagonism. Mr. Henderson began his argument. He was loud, theatrical, full of bluster. He paced back and forth, using sweeping gestures. His arguments were weak, built on technicalities and misinterpretations of the law, but he delivered them with confidence. He spoke directly to the judge, rarely glancing at Delilah. He talked about boilerplate contracts, about personal responsibility, about the plaintiff's supposed negligence. As he spoke, he paused occasionally, glancing towards Martha. The clerk would offer a small, almost imperceptible nod, or a slight, encouraging smile. It was a silent communication, a show of support for Henderson's performance. Delilah watched this exchange, a cold knot forming in her stomach. This wasn't just a clerk being rude. This felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine her, to create an atmosphere of dismissal in the court itself. It felt like the system was aligned against her, from the smiling clerk to the impassive judge who allowed it. She picked up her pen, turning it slowly between her fingers. She made a note on her brief, not related to Henderson's argument, but a reminder to herself. Observe the patterns. Henderson finished his flourish, returning to his seat with a self-satisfied air. Judge Reed turned his attention back to Delilah. "Ms. Brooks, your response?" His voice was still flat. Delilah stood. She didn't rush. She straightened her jacket again, a small, deliberate movement that spoke of control. She felt the quiet expectation in the room. She needed to respond not just to Henderson's legal points, but to the entire atmosphere that had been created. She started by addressing Henderson's arguments directly, dismantling them one by one with calm precision. She cited case law, referenced specific clauses in the contract, and highlighted the deceptive practices used against her client. She could feel Henderson growing restless. He shifted in his seat, whispered to his co-counsel. Delilah ignored him. She focused her gaze on the judge, presenting the facts, the law, the truth of her client's situation. Her voice was steady, unwavering. As she spoke about the predatory nature of the contract, about how it was designed to confuse and trap vulnerable individuals, she saw Martha react again. This time, it wasn't laughter. It was a subtle shake of the head, a dismissive flick of her wrist as she looked down at her papers. It was a silent signal that said, "This is nonsense." It was more overt than the previous actions, less easily dismissed as a private moment. It was aimed at influencing the room, at signaling the clerk's disdain for Delilah's argument. Delilah paused mid-sentence. It was a calculated pause, just long enough to draw attention without being dramatic. She didn't look at Martha. She kept her gaze on the judge, but her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. She felt the weight of the disrespect settling on her shoulders. It was a burden she refused to carry silently. The judge remained still, watching her. The courtroom felt impossibly quiet. "Your Honor," Delilah said, her voice still low but now edged with a subtle firmness that hadn't been there before. She wasn't raising her voice, but she was raising the stakes. "I am presenting facts and legal arguments supported by evidence." She paused again, letting her words land. She felt the temperature in the room drop slightly. She didn't deviate from her legal points, not yet, but her delivery shifted. It became less about persuasion and more about stark truth. She spoke about the imbalance of power, the deliberate obfuscation in the contract's language, the specific financial ruin inflicted upon Mr. Sterling. As she detailed the human cost, she could feel the shift in the gallery, a quiet rustling, a tightening of attention. She glanced briefly towards the clerk's desk. Martha was no longer looking at her papers. Her head was up, her eyes fixed on Delilah, her expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. The smirk was back, but it was tighter now, less amused, more defensive. Delilah turned her full attention back to the judge. "The law exists, I believe, to protect the vulnerable, not to provide cover for those who would exploit them." She spoke these words directly, without flourish. She saw Judge Reed's eyes narrow slightly. He didn't speak. The silence that followed wasn't tension. It was attention. Delilah knew she had to address the underlying disrespect, the environment that allowed it. She couldn't name Martha directly, not without risking being seen as unprofessional or disruptive. But she could speak to the atmosphere. It is difficult, Your Honor, to present a case demanding serious consideration when the very environment of the court seems to dismiss the gravity of the proceedings. Her statement hung in the air. It was a veiled reference, but clear enough. It spoke to the feeling in the room, the nonverbal cues that undermined her. She saw Martha flinch, a quick, involuntary movement. The clerk's face flushed slightly. Judge Reed shifted in his seat. His gaze flickered towards Martha for a split second, then back to Delilah. Mr. Henderson looked confused, then wary. Delilah felt a surge of something quiet and potent, not anger, but clarity. She had named the issue without directly accusing. She had brought the subtext into the light, forcing it to be acknowledged, even if only by implication. She stood taller, her shoulders squared. She wasn't waiting for a response. She was asserting her right to be heard with respect, within the confines of this court. She continued her argument, her voice gaining a quiet authority. She spoke about justice, about the principles the court was supposed to uphold. She wasn't lecturing, she was reminding, gently but firmly, what was at stake. She spoke about the trust people place in institutions, in the courts, in the law itself. She described Mr. Sterling's faith, how he believed the system would protect him. She didn't beg for sympathy, she presented it as a failure of that trust when predatory practices went unchecked. As she built her case, layer by layer, she could feel the shift in the room's energy. The initial dismissiveness had receded, replaced by a grudging attention. The gallery members leaned forward. Even Mr. Henderson sat still, watching her intently. Martha sat frozen, her eyes fixed on Delilah, the earlier smirk completely gone, replaced by a tight, anxious line. The confidence she had shared with Henderson earlier had evaporated. She looked trapped, exposed by Delilah's quiet persistence. Delilah paused again, looking directly at Judge Reed. Her voice was soft now, but carried immense weight. We ask this court, Your Honor, to remember its purpose. To look beyond the technicalities and see the life that has been broken. And to ensure that the decorum of this court reflects the seriousness of that purpose. It was another subtle jab, linking the requested outcome of the case to the need for respect within the courtroom itself. She was implicitly suggesting that the lack of decorum she had experienced was symptomatic of a system that could fail individuals like Mr. Sterling. She sat down slowly, deliberately. She didn't look at Martha. She looked at the judge, waiting. Judge Reed remained silent for a long moment. He looked from Delilah to Mr. Henderson, then his gaze lingered on Martha for a beat longer than necessary. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Martha avoided his gaze, staring down at her desk. The air in the room felt charged. Delilah felt a sense of profound calm settle over her. She had done all she could. She had presented her case, defended her client, and addressed the pervasive disrespect without losing her composure or descending into theatrics. She had fought the battle on her terms, with precision and quiet strength. She felt the eyes of the gallery on her, a collective holding of breath. This moment was bigger than her motion. It was about dignity in the face of casual contempt. Then Judge Reed spoke. His voice was different now. Still flat, but it held a new edge, a subtle acknowledgement of the shift in the room. Mr. Henderson, he said, not looking at the defense counsel, but addressing the space in front of him. Your arguments regarding contract boilerplate are noted. However, counsel for the plaintiff has raised significant questions regarding predatory intent and the unconscionable nature of the terms as applied in this specific instance. He paused. The court will require additional briefing on the issue of equitable relief, specifically regarding rescission based on undue influence and deceptive practice. He didn't mention the decorum issue directly, but the fact that he was asking for more information, delaying a potential dismissal, felt like a direct response to Delilah's comprehensive argument and the atmosphere she had forced him to acknowledge. He then looked towards Martha. Ms. Jenkins, he said, his voice noticeably sharper now. Martha started slightly, her head snapping up. Ensure that all filings related to this matter are processed with the utmost diligence and are brought to my attention immediately upon receipt. It was a directive, but also a subtle reprimand. In the language of the courtroom, being told to ensure utmost diligence, when that should be the standard, was a clear sign of displeasure. It was a public, albeit coded, correction. Martha nodded quickly, her face pale. "Yes, Your Honor," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The earlier confidence, the shared amusement with Henderson, was entirely gone. She looked small, exposed. The silent, disrespectful laughter from earlier felt impossibly distant now. Delilah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not of triumph, but of having been seen, of having held her ground and shifted the dynamics of the space through sheer presence and strategic truth-telling. She hadn't received an apology. There was no grand declaration, but the subtle shift in the judge's tone, the public instruction to the clerk, the look on Martha's face, these were acknowledgments. There were small cracks in the facade of casual dismissal. The courtroom atmosphere had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a place where disrespect could flourish unchecked, at least not without consequence. The air felt cleaner, though still heavy with the weight of the systemic challenges that remained. Mr. Henderson looked visibly annoyed, his earlier swagger deflated. He scribbled notes furiously. The gallery members exchanged quiet glances. The silence that returned to the courtroom after Judge Reed's instructions was different from the silence before. It wasn't anticipation, it was reflection. Delilah sat still, her hands resting on her brief. She felt the tremor of adrenaline fading, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. She had faced the disrespect head-on, not with anger, but with a steady light that exposed it. Martha avoided her gaze entirely now, focused intensely on her computer screen. The subtle alliance between the clerk and the defense counsel had been broken. The power structure in the room had been subtly but undeniably altered. The judge set the schedule for the additional briefings. Delilah took notes, her pen moving smoothly across the paper. She felt the eyes on her, the changed perception. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lost her temper, hadn't even directly named the disrespect. She had simply performed her job with such unwavering competence and quiet integrity that it forced the surrounding lack of integrity into sharp relief. The judge's final instructions were procedural, routine. "Court stands adjourned," he stated, banging his gavel. The sound was sharp, final. People began to stir, gathering their things. Delilah remained seated for a moment longer, letting the finality of the gavel resonate. She looked towards the clerk's desk. Martha did not look up. Her shoulders seemed slumped. The laughter that had cut through the tension earlier now felt like a distant, foolish echo. Delilah had not responded in kind, had not sought to humiliate or retaliate. She had simply stood her ground, upheld the principles of the court even when others failed to, and in doing so, had quietly reclaimed the dignity of the moment. She gathered her papers, rising smoothly. She didn't look at Henderson. She walked towards the door, her brief in hand. She felt the eyes following her, but the feeling was different now. It wasn't dismissive, it felt respectful. Or perhaps simply cautious. The battle was far from over for Mr. Sterling, but in this small, significant exchange, Delilah Brooks had shown the quiet power of standing firm, of letting grace and precision be the only response needed when faced with casual contempt. The air in the courtroom, though still formal, felt irrevocably changed by the brief, silent confrontation and its subtle aftermath.